Welcome to Coco Tales Reddit, where we pull back the curtain on the stories that are whispered between friends, the secrets we're almost too afraid to say out loud. Settle in, get comfortable. Tonight's story it's a heavy one. It's about that fine, invisible line between a mother's intuition and the terrifying reality of what can happen when that intuition is right. It's a reminder that sometimes the monsters we need to protect our children from aren't hiding in the shadows. They're standing in plain sight, smiling right at us. It all started so innocently, so innocently that I almost feel foolish looking back on it now. My daughter, Emma, was 13, right in the thick of that awkward, beautiful, messy transition from girl to young woman. And, like most 13-year-olds, school was her personal battlefield, a place of immense boredom she'd do anything to escape. Just 2 weeks before my world tilted on its axis, she had tried to pull the most dramatic play dead routine to get out of class, complete with a thermometer held up to a light bulb. She was that girl, the one who lived for weekends and counted down the seconds to the final bell. So you can imagine my surprise when, seemingly overnight, my daughter became a morning person. Not just a morning person, but an excited for school person. She was up before her alarm, humming as she went through her closet, something I hadn't witnessed since her first day of kindergarten. The dramatic sighs over homework were replaced with focus. The girl who used to drag herself out of bed was suddenly bouncing with energy. Naturally, my guard went up, but it was a soft guard, a curious one. I asked her what had prompted this miraculous transformation. "Oh," she said, her cheeks flushing just a little. "I have Mr. Davidson for history now, every day. His class is just super fun." I smiled, genuinely happy for her. Every parent wants their kid to find that one teacher, that one class, that sparks something in them. I was just relieved she wasn't miserable anymore, and I didn't give it a second thought. But then a week later, the humming turned into a full-blown production. Emma started setting her alarm a whole 30 minutes earlier, not for studying, but to curate the perfect outfit. Now, Emma wasn't someone who didn't care about her appearance, but her style was usually one of comfortable convenience. The first clean thing on the floor was her signature look. Suddenly, she was experimenting with makeup, just a little mascara, a touch of lip gloss, and spending ages on her hair. One morning, I caught her staring at her reflection, biting her lip with a look of intense concentration. I leaned against her doorframe, a teasing smile on my face. "Trying to impress a special someone?" I asked, thinking of some cute boy in her class. Her face went from pale to crimson in a heartbeat. "Don't say that, Mom!" she snapped, turning away from the mirror abruptly. The reaction was so sharp, so defensive, it caught me off guard. That was the first real crack in the facade. That was the moment a tiny, cold knot of suspicion began to form in my stomach. From that day on, I started watching. Not like a hawk, not at first. More like a quiet observer in my own home. I started paying closer attention to her moods, which I had always chalked up to normal teenage hormones, and I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that her emotional weather vane pointed directly at one person, Mr. Davidson. She would never, ever admit it, of course, but the evidence was undeniable. If she came home floating on air, humming that same little tune, I would casually ask about her day, and she'd gush, "Mr. Davidson said my project was one of the most insightful he's seen from a student my age." On those days, she'd float around the house for hours, helping with dinner, telling me about her friends, being the open, bubbly girl I knew and loved. But on the bad days were silent. If she came home and went straight to her room, shutting the door with a quiet click, I knew. She'd come down for dinner and just pick at her food, her eyes distant. I'd ask how school was, and she'd just shrug. Fine. I'd press a little, gently. How was history? A one-word answer. Okay. I knew, without her saying a word, that Mr. Davidson hadn't given her the attention she was craving that day. Her entire happiness was tethered to this man's approval. That's when I decided to test my theory. It felt sneaky, manipulative even, but I had to know. One evening, during a quiet dinner, I brought it up as casually as I could. You know, honey, I started. I was looking at your schedule, and I was thinking of maybe moving you out of Mr. Davidson's class. Before I could even finish the sentence, to offer some made-up reason like balancing her course load, she exploded. You can't do that, she yelled, her fork clattering onto her plate. Her eyes were wide with panic, a look I had never seen on her face before. I stared at her, my own face a blank mask of shock. Why not? I asked, keeping my voice level. Silence. A heavy, deafening silence filled the space between us. She just stared back at me, her jaw tight. Then, without another word, she pushed her chair back, stood up, and made a beeline for her room. As she walked away, she was already pulling her phone out, her thumbs flying across the screen to text someone before she even hit the stairs. This wasn't my Emma. My Emma, who just a couple of months ago couldn't have cared less about school. My Emma, who had always been so incredibly open with me about everything, from friendship drama to her latest celebrity crush. That open book was now slammed shut, locked tight. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the key was with Mr. Davidson. This wasn't a crush. This was a problem. A huge, terrifying problem. And I had no idea what to do next. That night, the house was quieter than I'd ever heard it. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on me after Emma had stormed off. I sat on the living room couch for what felt like hours, just staring at the blank television screen, replaying that look of sheer panic in her eyes over and over again. The question wasn't if something was wrong anymore. The question was, how wrong was it? My mind raced, trying to find a logical, rational explanation. Maybe it was just an intense crush. Maybe I was being a paranoid, overprotective mother. But my gut was screaming at me. And I know this is the part of the story where some of you might judge me. I judged myself for it. But I also know that any mother who has felt that primal, terrifying fear for her child's safety would understand. I decided to check her phone. The thought alone felt like a betrayal. I had always preached about trust and privacy with Emma. We had an open relationship, or at least I thought we did. But this wasn't about catching her in a lie about homework or sneaking out. This was a gut feeling that she was in danger. A feeling so strong it was like a physical ache in my chest. I waited until I was sure she was asleep. I crept up the stairs, each step creaking like a gunshot in the silent house. Her door was slightly ajar, and I could hear her soft, even breathing. I slipped into her room, my heart pounding against my ribs. Her phone was on her nightstand, charging. My hands were trembling as I picked it up. I knew her password. We'd always shared them in case of emergencies. This, I told myself, was an emergency. I went straight to her texts, scrolling through conversations with her friends, looking for any mention of him. Nothing. I checked her Instagram DMs, her Snapchat. Again, nothing. A wave of doubt washed over me. Was I crazy? Was I inventing a crisis where there was only teenage drama? I was about to put the phone back, to retreat and apologize to my sleeping daughter for my paranoia. But that nagging feeling wouldn't let go. It was like a splinter in my mind. I started looking through the other apps on her phone, even the ones she rarely used, and that's when I saw it. Tucked away in a folder with other generic utility apps was a second email client. An app I didn't recognize. My breath caught in my throat. I tapped it open, and my blood ran cold. There was only one email thread. The sender's name was his, Mr. Davidson. It was a backup email account she had made, seemingly for the sole purpose of communicating with him. The last email from him, sent just that evening, was sitting at the top. It read, "Can't wait to see you during my free period tomorrow." My hand started shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone steady. I took a deep, shuddering breath and opened the thread. What I read next made me want to be sick right there on her bedroom floor. It was a long, horrifying history of manipulation. He was telling my 13-year-old daughter that she was special and mature for her age. He told her that their connection was profound, something that transcended normal student-teacher relationships. It was a masterclass in grooming, and my daughter was falling for every single word. He sent her photos of things he wanted to give her, little gifts. Her replies were short, excited, and damning. She'd tell him she was hiding them in her bag so I wouldn't find them. As soon as I read that, I put the phone down and quietly moved toward her school backpack, which was slumped in the corner of her room. I felt like a trespasser in my own daughter's life, my hands fumbling with the zipper, my stomach churning with nausea. And there they were, tucked beneath her textbooks and binders. Expensive makeup, the kind of professional stuff you see at Sephora, not the drugstore. A silk blouse that was far too mature for a 13-year-old. And underneath it all, a pair of stockings, gifts from him. Tangible, physical proof that this wasn't just in my head. This was real. I wanted to puke. I wanted to scream. I wanted to march over to his house and burn it to the ground. What do you even do in that moment? What is the rule book for when you realize a predator has his hooks in your child? The word just kept echoing in my brain, grooming. My daughter was being groomed. My first instinct was to grab Emma, wake her up, and confront her. My second was to call the police, the school, anyone who would listen. But a cold, practical fear stopped me. This wasn't just any teacher. And as that realization dawned, the true horror of my situation began to settle in. But for now, standing in the dark of my daughter's room, surrounded by the evidence of his poison, I knew I had to be smart. Fighting this wouldn't be simple. Trying to keep my hands from shaking, I picked up my own phone. While trying not to scream, I took pictures of everything. I photographed every single incriminating email. I took pictures of the makeup, the blouse, the stockings, all laid out on her floor. I was building a case, with no idea who I would ever be able to show it to. Standing there in the quiet of my daughter's room, with the camera roll on my phone full of the most sickening evidence, my first instinct was pure, unadulterated rage. I wanted to storm the gates, tell the school, tell the police, tell someone. The primal urge to protect my child was a roaring fire in my chest, and it demanded action. It demanded justice, right now. I imagined marching into the principal's office first thing in the morning, slapping my phone down on the desk, and watching the color drain from their face. But as the initial shockwave of adrenaline began to subside, it was replaced by a cold, creeping dread. A much more practical and terrifying part of my brain took over, and it started connecting the dots. Mr. Davidson wasn't just some random rogue teacher. I started to recall little bits of information, fragments of conversations from PTA meetings and school newsletters, and the picture that formed made my stomach drop all over again. Mr. Davidson's parents were the Davidsons, the ones who had just funded the new science wing. Their name was on a big, shiny plaque right by the school's entrance. His wife wasn't just a supportive spouse. She was on the school board, one of the people who would be deciding his fate. My complaint wouldn't just be against a teacher, it would be against her husband. And then the final, most chilling piece of the puzzle fell into place. His brother. His brother was the new chief of police. The same man who had just stood on stage at our last PTA meeting, smiling warmly, talking about his department's commitment to protecting our community's children. I had clapped for him. I had felt reassured by his speech. Now the memory of his face made me feel physically ill. If I went to the school, I'd be silenced by a donation. If I went to the police, I'd be reporting a man to his own brother. His entire family was woven into the very fabric of this town's power structure. They weren't just a family, they were an institution. And I was just a mom, a frantic, emotional mother with a handful of screenshots. I could see exactly how it would play out. They would patronize me, question my daughter's stability, call her a confused teenager with a crush. They would call me hysterical. They would protect their own, and in the process, they would likely destroy me and my daughter. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. I felt utterly, completely trapped. The very systems that were supposed to protect us were the ones that would ensure he got away with it. So, I did the only thing I could think of. If I couldn't trust the system, I would have to become my own. I wouldn't be a frantic, emotional mother. I would be a detective. I would be a spy. And I would be patient. From that night on, I lived a double life. To the outside world, and especially to Emma, I pretended everything was completely normal. I made her favorite breakfast, asked about her friends, and talked about mundane things. I smiled and nodded when she mentioned history class, burying the rage that bubbled up every time she said his name. I had to be a fortress of calm, because if I cracked, he would know something was up. My secret life began the moment she left for school. I started documenting everything with a chilling sense of purpose. I backed up the photos of the emails and the gifts to 3 different cloud services, creating multiple redundancies. I started a private journal, noting every mood swing, every comment she made about him, with dates and times. I became an archivist of my own daughter's grooming. Then, I took it a step further. I signed up to be a volunteer at the school library, choosing a schedule that overlapped with Emma's history class, which was just down the hall. Emma never knew I was there. I would sit behind a stack of books, pretending to sort them, but really, I was watching. I saw how he would find little reasons to talk to her in the hallway, how his hand would linger on her shoulder for just a second too long. I saw the special conspiratorial smiles he gave her when no one else was looking. Seeing it in person was 1,000 times worse than reading it in an email. It was a slow-motion horror film happening right in front of me. At home, my mission was even more delicate. I knew I couldn't just confront Emma and show her the evidence. She was still under his spell. She would defend him, and it would drive an even deeper wedge between us. So I started my own subtle counter-programming campaign. I started suggesting we watch documentaries together in the evenings, choosing ones about consent, power dynamics, and the psychology of manipulation. I'd talk about news stories I'd randomly seen online about teachers who had hurt their students, discussing them with a tone of sadness and disbelief. I watched her closely during these moments. I could practically see the hamster wheel in her head starting to turn. She'd grow quiet, her eyes fixed on the screen. She'd start fidgeting nervously, picking at a loose thread on the couch or biting her fingernails down to the quick. Often, she'd get up halfway through, mumbling an excuse about needing to finish homework, and escape to her room. It was painful to watch, seeing her mind grapple with these 2 conflicting realities. But I also saw a tiny flicker of hope. The defensiveness was slowly being replaced by doubt. The adoring gaze was being clouded by confusion. She was smart. I knew she was. And deep down, she was starting to understand. She was finally, slowly, realizing the truth of what was happening to her. My plan was working, but it was agonizingly slow, and I felt like I was in a race against a clock I couldn't see, praying I would get to her before he did. My slow, careful campaign of planting seeds of doubt was a delicate, agonizing process. I was walking a tightrope, trying to guide my daughter back to safety without startling her and making her run right back to him. I was seeing progress, those little flickers of recognition in her eyes, and I was holding on to that hope with everything I had. But that fragile progress, that tightrope I was walking, was about to be cut short by what I now refer to as the worst day of my life. It was a Tuesday. I remember the sky was a bright, cloudless blue. It was a completely ordinary day. Until it wasn't blank, Emma came home from school early. The sound of the front door opening hours before it should have sent a jolt of panic through me. I found her standing in the entryway, her backpack slipping from one shoulder, her face pale and empty. "Honey, what's wrong? Are you sick?" I asked, rushing over to her. She looked at me, her eyes hollow. "I saw him, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw him do it with another girl. Exactly what he did with me." My heart stopped. I guided her to the couch and sat her down, my own legs feeling unsteady. She took a deep, shaky breath, as if the words themselves were physically painful to let out. "At recess," she started, staring at her hands in her lap, "Mr. Davidson was talking to this other girl, and he used the same words, Mom. The exact same words." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting something from a textbook. He told her, "You're special. You're different from the others. I love talking to you." She looked up at me, and I could see the cracks forming in her composure. He looked right into her eyes when he said it, and he touched her shoulder, just like he did with me. My mouth went dry. I had known this. In my heart, I had known he was a predator, that Emma wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last. But hearing it confirmed, hearing it from my own daughter's lips, seeing her face crumble as she realized her special connection, was nothing but a recycled script. It was like taking a physical punch to the stomach. "And the worst part," she continued, her voice finally breaking, "is that he looked at me right after. He looked right at me and his face didn't change. It was like I was invisible. Like everything he ever said to me was just rehearsal." That was it. The dam broke. She folded in on herself, burying her face in her hands as deep, guttural sobs shook her whole body. All my rage, my need to say I knew it, just evaporated. All that was left was my daughter, heartbroken and shattered. I wrapped my arms around her and held her tight. "Emma, listen to me," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "You are not to blame for anything. None of this is your fault, okay?" "I thought he cared about me, Mom," she cried into my shoulder. "I really thought I was important, that he really saw me." She squeezed her eyes shut, as if she could physically erase the last few months from her memory. Then she pulled back a little, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "He said he wanted to meet me today after class," she whispered. "He said he had a special gift for me." I froze. This was it. This was the escalation I had been terrified of. He was trying to isolate her, to get her alone, using the promise of another gift to lure her in. My precious, innocent daughter hadn't yet put a name to what he was planning, but I knew the name, and it was disgusting. I hugged her again, swallowing the scream that was clawing its way up my throat. "You're not going," I whispered in her ear. "He will never ever come near you again. I promise." She trembled in my arms, but the crying subsided, replaced by a profound, empty exhaustion. She fell asleep right there on the couch, completely drained. I carefully covered her with a blanket and tiptoed out of the living room, closing the door behind me. Standing in the quiet hallway, everything shifted. The time for watching from the sidelines, for planting subtle seeds, was over. I couldn't wait for her to process it, couldn't trust the school's protocols, couldn't hope for the best. He had tried to get her alone today. Today. My quiet, methodical plan had been a fool's errand. I needed to act, and I needed to act now. But to do that, I needed more than her testimony, more than my screenshots. I needed cold, hard, undeniable proof. I needed to show the world, and maybe even a part of her, exactly who this monster was. My heartbreak from my daughter had just become my battle cry. After I closed the living room door on my sleeping, heartbroken daughter, I didn't move for a long time. I just stood in the dark, my heart a restless, pounding drum against my ribs. My mind was a whirlwind of rage and terror. I knew that I couldn't just go to sleep and pretend that a good night's rest would make this go away. This wasn't a teenage fight or a simple misunderstanding. It was serious. Too serious. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I needed undeniable proof. I went back to Emma's room, my steps slow and deliberate. I took a deep breath and picked up her phone from the nightstand where she'd left it. Using it before had felt like a violation. This time, it felt like arming myself for war. It was no longer just permitted, it was necessary. I opened the messaging app, my hands surprisingly steady, and went straight to his conversation history. The latest messages were still there, a monument to his sickening manipulation. He called her his smart girl, told her she had a different glow, that her way of seeing the world was unique for someone so young. The words were so carefully crafted to sound like encouragement, but I knew they were poison. I took a deep breath and began to type, my mind racing to channel the voice of a curious, infatuated 13-year-old. "Hi," I wrote, pretending to be her. "You said you had a special gift. What is it?" His response came back in seconds, as if he had been sitting there, just waiting for her. "You'll love it. I chose it with care." Another message popped up immediately after. "But I'll only show you if you promise not to tell anyone. It's just ours, okay?" I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and continued the charade. "Where are we going to meet?" He sent the address of a remote park, suggesting a time late in the afternoon the next day. "It's safer there," he wrote, followed by a winking emoji that made my skin crawl. And then he added the line that froze the blood in my veins. "Bring that black purse you used last week. You look beautiful in it." My body went rigid. This wasn't just a teacher crossing a line with words. This was planned. The detail about the purse, it meant he was watching her, cataloging her, fetishizing her. The confidence in his writing told me this wasn't the first time he'd done this. He knew exactly how to manipulate. I continued the dialogue, maintaining the pose of a curious and anxious girl, and he began to open up even more. He said he had been waiting for this moment for a long time, that it was hard to restrain himself in class, and that she needed to understand their bond was too special to fit within the school. He used all the classic, predatory buzzwords: true connection, secret friendship, freedom to be who we are. Each sentence felt like a blade twisting in my chest. I took screenshots of everything, copied the messages, and saved them in multiple places. I finally put the phone down and buried my face in my hands, taking deep, shaky breaths. The evidence was damning, but who could I take it to? The school board where his wife sat? The police department run by his brother? I was a powerless citizen up against a protected man. I had seen stories like this before, and they always ended the same way. The victim discredited, the predator quietly transferred with a clean record. But a new, hard resolve began to form in my heart. If the system was rotten, then I would create my own. With trembling fingers, I opened my laptop and typed into the search bar, "How to report online predators without involving local authorities." For hours, I fell down a rabbit hole of forums, articles, and gut-wrenching stories. It was terrifying to see how common this was, and how many powerful people were willing to look the other way. And then I found it. It was on Instagram, of all places. A video with the title, "We Caught Him Live. He'll Never Approach Anyone Again." The page belonged to a group of online vigilantes who confronted predators. I watched video after video. Their method was brilliant in its simplicity. They would take over the victim's profile, arrange a meeting in a busy public place, and show up with cameras and all the evidence. They confronted the aggressor directly but calmly, exposing them on the spot before calling the police with a fully documented case. There was no violence, no chaos. It was strategy, control, and exposure. It was exactly what I needed. My heart pounding, I sent them a message. I didn't hold back. I told them I was a mother, that I had screenshots, a meeting address, a time, everything. I attached the evidence. I ended with a sentence that was the truest thing I had ever written. If I don't do something now, he'll do it to another child, maybe worse. I waited for an hour, maybe two. Then, a notification. A response. "We've read everything. It's serious. Very serious. We're going to help you." My eyes filled with tears of pure, unadulterated relief. They asked for a video call right then. A group of 4 people appeared on my screen, all of them with firm, respectful voices. They laid out the plan. They would take over the conversation with him, playing his game until the trap was set. We would move the meeting to a busy park on Saturday, giving us 3 days to prepare. Everything would be recorded from multiple angles, and the police would only be called when they had him cornered with irrefutable proof. "And you won't need to get involved," one of them said gently. "Just tell us where you'll be, and you can watch from a safe distance." I agreed instantly, but my insides were a knot of panic and fear. The risk was immense. But then I looked over at Emma's phone, remembering the vile words he'd written, and thought of my daughter sleeping peacefully, believing she was special because a predator had told her so. She was special, not because of him, but for being my daughter. And no one had the right to play with that. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by her bed, watching her breathe, and made a silent vow. "He will never touch you again," I promised her sleeping form. "Not even with words. Never again." Saturday dawned with a strange, heavy silence. The 3 days leading up to it were the longest of my life. A blur of forced smiles for Emma and frantic, whispered planning with the vigilante group. When I left the house that morning, I told Emma I was going to the big weekend market across town. A believable excuse for being gone for a few hours. She nodded, still subdued, and had no way of knowing that her mother was on her way to orchestrate the takedown of the man who had broken her heart. I parked my car half a mile from the park and walked the rest of the way, my heart hammering against my ribs. I positioned myself behind a large oak tree, my hands sweaty and my legs shaking. I saw them immediately. The group was already there, a picture of discreet professionalism. One man, looking like a college student, was adjusting a camera on a tripod, partially hidden in a large bush. Another woman was pretending to take landscape photos with her phone, her lens aimed perfectly at the designated meeting spot. A third member sat on a bench, calmly eating a sandwich and observing everything from behind his sunglasses. And the fourth, a young man who couldn't have been more than 19, was sitting on the bench where the meeting was supposed to happen, head down, looking at his phone, playing the part of the nervous teenager Davidson was expecting to meet. And then he appeared. Mr. Davidson. He walked along the gravel path with a light, almost bouncing step, a relaxed smile on his face. He was wearing a light polo shirt and pressed jeans, looking for all the world like a happy-go-lucky guy on his way to a pleasant weekend outing. He seemed so happy, so carefree, as if meeting a student in secret at a remote park was the most normal thing in the world. The sight of him, so utterly oblivious, sent a fresh wave of rage through me. He approached the young man on the bench, the decoy. "Hi," he said, his voice carrying on the quiet air. It was the signal. In that instant, the group moved. It was like watching a silent, perfectly choreographed dance. The three other members closed in around Davidson, forming a silent, inescapable triangle. The cameraman stepped out from the bushes, his lens now pointed directly at Davidson's face. "Mr. Davidson," one of them said, his voice firm and unwavering, "we know why you're here." Davidson stopped, his smile faltering. He looked around, confused. "Excuse me, who are you?" "We're people who protect children," the woman said, holding up her phone to show him the screenshots. "And we have everything you wrote to a 13-year-old girl, thinking she would be here today." The color drained from his face. He turned ghostly pale. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "This is a setup." "Then why did you bring this gift?" the man from the bench asked, pointing to the small decorated bag in Davidson's hand. They began reading his own words back to him, the vile, manipulative phrases I now knew by heart. He started sweating, backing away, trying to laugh it off as a joke, but his panic was palpable. "I'm going to call a lawyer. This is illegal," he sputtered. "What's illegal is what you were doing with a minor, Mr. Davidson," the leader replied calmly. That's when he broke. He turned and tried to run, but he didn't get 2 steps. 2 of the young men were on him in a flash, not violently, but firmly blocking his path. He lost his balance and fell backward onto the grass, his pristine jeans now smeared with dirt. He sat there, panting and exposed. By now, people in the park were stopping to stare, their own phones out and recording. The truth was spreading like wildfire, right before my eyes. "We've already called the police," the group leader said, holding up his phone. As Davidson tried to scramble up, one of the vigilantes gave him a firm push back down. Then, he leaned in and delivered a sharp, stinging slap across Davidson's face. He looked directly at the camera and said, "This is for what you tried to do to this woman's daughter." My heart froze. I felt seen. I felt avenged. When the patrol car arrived, its lights flashing, it was over quickly. The officers were already aware of the situation, one of them saying they'd seen the live broadcast. Davidson was handcuffed right there in front of everyone, his head hung in shame. As they led him away, he looked back, and for a split second, I almost felt a flicker of pity for the pathetic, broken man he was. But then I pictured Emma's face, her world shattering, and that feeling evaporated like mist in the Sunday. His arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The detective called me a few days later. A search of his apartment had uncovered exchanges with at least 4 other teenage girls. He had been doing this for years. When the group posted the edited video of the confrontation, it went viral. Dozens of other parents came forward, sharing stories of secret gifts and strange behavior that now finally made sense. Our single voice had become a chorus. Davidson was sentenced to a long term, with no possibility of appealing in freedom, and my Emma, began to heal. With therapy and support, she slowly started to understand that she was a victim of manipulation, not a fool. The trauma was still there, but it was joined by a new strength. One day, she looked at me with clear eyes and said, "Mom, I want to use what happened to me to help other girls." She was no longer just my daughter. She was a survivor, a voice for others. We started speaking at schools, not to share graphic details, but to teach, to alert, to remind everyone that danger sometimes says good morning in the hallway. We had won, and he would never, ever have the chance to deceive anyone again. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the sun is setting, I find myself sitting on the porch, and it all comes rushing back. The memory of it plays out like a nightmare I can't quite shake, a film reel of fear and anger and desperation. But then Emma will appear, laughing about something she read in a book, or she'll call me over to show me a new illustration she drew, her face full of passion and life. And I remember that it wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and we survived. But no one came out of it the same. Emma is a different girl now. She's still sweet, but her sweetness is layered with a wisdom I never wanted her to have at this age. She learned, with a hardness that still aches in my heart, that the world can be dangerous even in the places that are supposed to be the safest. But she also discovered her own strength. She learned that her voice matters, and that when she uses it, it can change everything. She still goes to therapy, not because she's broken, but because she knows that taking care of her mind is just as important as taking care of her body. And the other day she told me something that made me want to cry with pride. She said, "Mom, I'll never again think that staying quiet is the easier choice." And me? Well, I changed, too. I was always the type to resolve things with patience and dialogue. But when it comes to protecting your child, you discover a strength you never knew you had, a ferocity that comes from the deepest part of your soul. Today, I'm active in educational campaigns, helping other parents learn to identify the early signs of manipulation. I learned to listen not just with my ears, but with my eyes, with my heart. For a long time, I blamed myself for not noticing sooner. But I understand now that guilt doesn't build anything. Vigilance does. Attentive love saves. So that's our story. And now, I want to turn it over to you, the Cocoa Tales community, because there are so many parts of this that I still wrestle with, and I need to hear what you think. My first question is about that first step I took. I violated my daughter's privacy by checking her phone. I know in my heart it was the right thing to do, but it still feels like a betrayal. So, tell me, where is the line? When does a parent's intuition give them the right to cross that boundary into their child's private world? Was I right? Or did I just get lucky? And what about the vigilantes? That group of strangers who helped me when no one else would. They were my heroes, my only option in a corrupt system. But is taking justice into your own hands ever really okay? Are these groups a necessary answer to a broken system? Or do they risk creating more chaos and danger? I owe them everything, but the question still lingers. Finally, let's talk about the community. The school, the parents, the whole town. They only woke up and changed after a public viral shaming. Why does it so often take a huge, dramatic explosion for people to finally listen to victims and believe them? What is our responsibility, as neighbors and friends and parents, to see the quiet red flags before they turn into a wildfire? We survived, and my daughter is turning her pain into power, but the scars are still there. If this story made you feel understood, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Cocoa Table Reddit. Every follow and comment gives me the motivation to keep sharing these real, emotional stories with you. And if you have a story of your own, feel free to share it in the comments. I'm always here to listen. Now, let's talk about it in the comments.